So this next step when dealing with functional dependencies is to identify the trivial functional dependencies. Now, ideally, you are not going to have any trivial functional dependencies, and in fact, on your assignments and exams, I don't want to see your trivial functional dependencies. However, you should work through this step to determine if you do have any trivial functional dependencies so that you can get rid of them. So the first trivial functional dependency is the augmented functional dependency, which states that non-key attributes, which are the attributes on the right of a functional dependency, are functionally dependent on a subset of its determinant. The determinant is the attributes on the left of the arrow. So when it's saying that non-key attributes are dependent on a subset, it means that there could be multiple attributes on the left, but only one of those is necessary to determine the non-key attributes. So for example, if I have order ID and order date together determining customer ID, and I have order ID determining customer ID, then it's sufficient for me to say that order ID determining customer ID is plenty, because if I say John is heavier than Sue, and John and a sack of potatoes are heavier than Sue, does the sack of potatoes give me any more information? No, because I already know that John is heavier than Sue, so in this case we're going to just stick with order ID determining customer ID. The second type of trivial functional dependency is the equivalent functional dependency, which states that the determinants, which are the attributes on the left, and non-key attributes, which are the attributes on the right, are interchangeable. So for example, if I know the product ID, I will know the description. But also if I know the description, you may argue that I'll know the product ID. In this case, you're going to want to determine which functional dependency you're going to keep and get rid of the other. So I'm going to keep product ID determining description and get rid of the other one. So based on our previous example, we identified a bunch of attributes that determined other attributes. Now let's go ahead and get rid of the trivial functional dependencies. So as we look through these, we can see several that are augmented and several that are equivalent. So for example, these three that are highlighted in green are augmented trivial functional dependencies because order ID alone determines customer ID, name, and address in the first bullet point, and so we no longer need order ID and order date determining those same three attributes. The same goes for the fifth bullet point. Description is not necessary because product ID alone in the fourth bullet point determines finish and price. The same goes for the eighth bullet point, where customer ID and name determine address, when the seventh bullet point alone says that customer ID determines address, so the name is just extra information. Additionally, we have equivalent functional dependencies. So for example, if we said in the sixth bullet point that description determines product ID, and in the fourth bullet point we say product ID determines description, these are equivalent functional dependencies, and we're going to get rid of one of them, so we get rid of the sixth bullet point in this case. And finally, the last bullet point says that name determines customer ID. You may argue that this is not even a functional dependency at all, but if we did have this as a functional dependency, we would also see that our third to the last bullet point has customer ID determining name, and so we have equivalent functional dependencies here, and we need to get rid of that last bullet point. So now what I want you to do is identify any trivial functional dependencies that exist in the following functional dependencies. So try this on your own, pause this video, and then come back to compare your answers. All right, welcome back. So here we can see that there are several trivial functional dependencies. So the first one that we're going to look at is the shipment ID and shipment date determining origin, destination, ship ID, name, captain ID, and captain name. You'll notice here that shipment alone also determines all those same attributes. So this is a trivial functional dependency, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then we come down here and we can see that item ID determines description and description determines item ID. This is equivalent functional dependency, and so we can get rid of this second one and keep the item ID determines description and weight. And then finally this last one where we have shipment ID and ship ID determining ship name, captain ID, and captain name. But if we again look at shipment ID, we will see that shipment ID determines ship name, captain ID, and captain name. So this extra information is not necessary, and this is what we call an augmented trivial functional dependency. So we'll go ahead and get rid of those three, and we're left with the remaining 5 functional dependencies.